Hello, hello. So I will just assume that it is fine for everyone for me to start. Uh, Hello and welcome. My name is Marta. Today we will be doing rebuttal. Like what are the most common mistakes here and how to avoid them. I have a presentation, but beware, it is a very bad one. It has been done by Copilot and it is very bad in terms of like design and how it looks. So this is another example to why AI will not replace us yet. But in order for me to do that, I will need to be able to share my screen. So I guess this is a question for William.
There you go. You should be able to now.
Let's try it. Oh, fabulous. I can now. Just do the slide thing. Oh, now I'm going to reveal everything. Give me just a second. Okay. So, as I said, we will be doing rebuttal. Three things from the top. One, I already said the presentation will be bad. It will contain some grammar and spelling mistakes. Like, let's just have a vibe of it. Like, second of all, if you wish to ask something, or maybe I'm speaking too fast, or maybe too slow, please just like raise your hand, like use the option in Zoom. I will try and respond. And if I don't do that and your hand is up for a very long time, please feel free to interrupt me verbally as well. And I had the third thing, but that does not. Oh, yeah. I might stutter at times. It happens when I'm quite tired, as I am now. So let's just not be too bothered by that. And I apologize in advance. Okay, let's start. So what is the overview? So what is this? So we will be doing like what are the most common mistakes that we are facing like when we are like doing like rebuttal. I judge a lot, so I have seen a lot of mistakes. So hopefully this will shine a light. So second of all, I will like share a protocol that I follow for like responding to arguments. It is not fully mine, but I think it will be useful. Then we will deal with a very good example of I like offer rebuttal speech. It is shared online, so we will just watch a snippet of it. So hopefully it will be good. And then I will share some exercises that can help you with improving your like rebuttal skills. And then at the end, Q&A, of course. So let's start with the mistakes. So first one, and I know this is like going to sound strange, but it happens fairly often. People do not rebut at all. And it seems to be kind of trend in debating in 2024. A lot of the judges that I'm speaking with share this sentiment. I've also seen it a lot in Vietnam worlds. People just choose to ignore the arguments presented. They just don't respond to them at all. They act as if they do not exist. They like run a parallel analysis to what was said. So I think this is a negative trend, and I cannot pin it to why it happens. I think that we are just getting worse at listening, like during the debate. And I know that like when you think of debating, you think of like speaking and thinking fast, but I think that we need to be much more focusing on actively listening, on being very engaged and very present in the debate which is happening, and not being too much into our own heads and into our own arguments. So let's just like be mindful of this. And I know this is hard because a lot of us have ADHD or like we are brain rot because of TikTok. But I truly believe that if we make a conscious effort to just like listen more, I think this will go a very long way. I think the second thesis which I have to why this is happening is because we just try to write too much. So what I see very often is a LO starts speaking and the DPM automatically starts like writing their responses. They don't even like listen to the end of the argument. So what happens very often is you start like to write like your response to the first argument, and then you completely devote your time and attention to it, and you don't listen to the second or the third argument with the speaker like has. So this is something which does happen like fairly often, and I think it stems from us just like writing a lot. And I think a skill to also be aware of is we need to write slightly less, and we need to conversely like listen a lot more. So yeah, so this is the first mistake. People just don't rebut at all, almost. So the second mistake, which I see, is that people don't respond to what was actually said. So even when like a rebuttal happens, it's very often not fundamentally dealing with the mechanisms like the team provided, or with the comparative, or with the impact. What people very often do, they respond to the tagline of the argument. So they hear a statement, and then they respond to that statement, but they don't respond to the specificity of how the argument was proven. So they don't respond to like the max or the impacts on the comparative. They just respond to what they think the idea of the argument is. And this is bad because very often this is just like a harder way to rebut an argument, but very often it is not very precise because the judge is following what was said. So the judge will know the specificity, and if you don't address it, that means that your like rebuttal will have to just like not be very good, or not be very specific, or not be like super precise. And I think that the key to like overcoming this mistake is just like tracking like very properly. I think this is something which is also a skill that is not that present in debating, or it's not emphasized that much, right? But I think that in order for you to be able to respond properly to an argument, you need to track it properly. Like this is a prerequisite or a precondition, if you like, to be able to respond to anything in a very good and comprehensive way. So I think this is just like a very first step. The way that I think like tracking could be improved for most people is to like split it into 2 parts. So the first part of tracking should be, I write what they are saying, but I'm not writing my responses to it. I try to listen a bit more, like reiterating what I said before. I try to listen a bit more to understand fully the argument. I try to like write it down, and then only in the second step am I writing my responses to it. And of course, like I cannot wait for the full speech to be done and then only write my responses. This needs to happen somewhat in parallel. However, I think the first emphasis should be, I need to track properly. I need to write down what they have said in a very clear and precise manner, and only then can I respond to the argument. Okay? So I think like tracking, a not very sexy skill in debating, but super useful, and we need to emphasize it more. So a third mistake, and we will do a bit of an exercise here, like just because I think this is such a fundamental mistake which so many people make, and that is they have a competing rebuttal and competing analysis instead of actually like responding to an argument. So in case you're not familiar with the term competing analysis, here's what it means. So just imagine there are 2 ways to like respond to an argument. So the first way will be to respond to the premise of the argument, to explain why the argument is flawed, like to explain that maybe like the comparative is not there, or maybe to explain that the like argument is not that impactful like in the round, so you will question the impact of it. Or for example, you will try to argue that actually the argument is not good if this is the side of Gov. So you will try to argue that the argument goes on your side. For example, like you're trying to flip an argument. I think this is how like colloquial, like we are calling it, right? So you're trying to do something with the argument. So this is one way to rebut it, and this is the correct way to rebut an argument. However, what most people do like very often is that they try to run a parallel analysis, which points out that maybe the impact of opening government can happen also, but only in the other way. And very often people don't respond to an argument, but they just assert an equally plausible counterclaim. And this term, like counterclaim, is something which you will hear fairly often from judges, right? So when they are judging, like they will say, oh, like the rebuttal like was not good. And then you will say, but I did respond to it, right? And then the judge will be like, yeah, but that was a counterclaim. And the counterclaim like fundamentally means that you don't disprove the argument. You just prove that something else, like completely opposite, is equally plausible. And this is why this is not a good way to respond to an argument, because again, you are not defeating the argument. You are just providing something which can be equally true. And of course, a judge will not know what to do with it, because again, the first argument was not disproven. Like, we now just have another additional analysis. And very often, yeah, the judge might buy your analysis, but they might also buy the analysis of the first team, right? So this is why this is not a very good way to rebut an argument, because fundamentally it is not doing that, right? It is just providing something that can be equally true, and then you're leaving it up to the judge for the judge to decide what they think and what they feel is true. And I don't want to go too much into detail on this, but there is a lovely short lecture done by Harish inside of the Korea judge training. And you can find it on YouTube. It is like 13 minutes long, and he goes into depth about explaining like what is the difference between true like rebuttal, the one that I like outlined firstly, and this competing rebuttal and competing analysis. Okay, so let's do a short exercise on competing like rebuttal. So we have a very simple debate. This house would legalize all recreational drugs. Okay, so here is the argument that now we need to rebut. And the argument is written here, so I'm just going to give you like 30 seconds for you to read it, and then I'm going to like reiterate it. And I can like sip some water in the meantime. Okay, so to reiterate the argument. So very often when you have illegal markets, they are not like regulated. And drug dealers very often have an incentive to like maximize profit. And very often they do that by like watering down the products like heroin or cocaine, because they're quite expensive, with some other additives which are very often awful for us, like for example like rat poison. And this is really bad for everyone who is like using drugs, meaning they suffer greatly like physically because of this. Okay, so this is the like argument for gov, and they basically say when government is like regulating this kind of behavior, and the lacking quality of drugs will not happen, right? Okay, how would you respond to this argument? So if you have an idea, just like raise your hand. Okay, a lot of people raise their hands, so like that. Let us see. So David raised his hand first.
I'll be heard.
Yes.
I think if you rebut it directly, so they say drug dealers want to maximize profit. And so even if they water them down, they probably water them down with stuff that's not going to greatly hurt the like people who are taking the drugs, as they want people to buy their drugs going forward and not like ruin reputation or kill people. So that's less money.
Okay, good. Now I see Jeremiah.
I was pretty much going to say the same thing, but I was going to say that quality would be an important thing for your reputation. And I guess, I forgot the second thing I was going to, I forgot the second thing I was going to say, but I was just kind of building off of that.
Okay, no worries. It completely makes sense. Now I see Samuel.
I was just basically gonna say that because those addicts are addicted to drugs, they would probably, like in either scenario, seek for the cheapest version of it, and they would continue addicted. So regardless of how bad that is, they would still be bad for their health.
Okay. Sure, that makes sense. Anyone else? Any idea? Oh, Jeremiah like reminded himself of what he said before.
Yeah.
So go.
I think the second thing that I was going to say is that the comparative, if all recreational drugs are legal, is just that more people are going to use them. And drugs are harmful to people anyways. So on the side where like all drugs are legalized, you still have a significant increase on the scale of harm to like different people who otherwise wouldn't have taken the step to do drugs. So then the next step would be to weigh up the harm, because even in the best case of this argument, there's an increased intensity of harm for small people, but in the comparative, there's a significant increase, even if it's, well, no, the harm that drugs create isn't small, like it's very significant. It also happens to like a lot of people. So I think weighing that out as well.
Okay, that makes sense. I see George. And
Yeah,
sorry for
just
westernizing your name.
Yeah, sorry. I would just attack the first sentence and say that governments have an incentive to regulate illegal markets and to minimize them as much as possible, penalize any type of, trafficking, and maybe give alerts to people about, this kind of tactic that people use while they sell drugs. I think that's like responsible.
That makes sense. Anyone else before I give my comments and thoughts? Srishti, yep.
Yeah, it was building upon what I guess Samuel said earlier, but like a precondition to that rebuttal to say that it's questioning the government's capability of regulating itself. So like, even if you legalize the drugs and you say the governments are now able to regulate it, but if the government team doesn't show a mechanism for what that regulation looks like, then we can just say that regulation itself wouldn't be good. So for example, in a lot of countries, corruption exists, which means even in the best case scenario, if you give licenses to some top drug dealers, I don't know, in the smaller rural areas or smaller towns, there is no capacity for the governments to actually regulate the, quality of those drugs. So once more people have a gateway to the drugs, and if they want to buy the cheaper ones because people are poor, the chances of them buying these additive drugs increases on government's world.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Wendy?
This is probably just adding to what Jeremiah said. I think the fact qualities are likely to be low or there is like additional poison in them actually acts as a direct disincentivizer or like a barrier of entry for people who are like on the border or hesitating whether or not to opt into taking recreational drugs. So it actually acts as an active deterrence because an average informed voter knows that drugs are in a very dodgy way or whatnot.
Okay, that makes sense. And now Refuge.
All right, so mine was on the lines of corruption. So government officials can obviously make deals with these partners, with these dealers to make sure they're taking in drugs like at lower prices and they water it down. So eventually they get to maximize profit and they get away with it. But secondarily, it's also going to be hard to sort of regulate and track every drug from time to time, whether all of them are purely formed or not, which means government's best case scenario doesn't materialize.
Okay, that makes sense. Any other comments or vibes on this argument? Okay, sure. I think this was lovely because I think we had examples of like true rebuttal, but also some competing like rebuttal. So firstly, what I think is probably not the correct way to rebut this, but probably the most efficient way. I think the most efficient way is to directly attack the premise. And as like you have identified, like a lot of you, the premise of this is that drug dealers have an incentive to water down the product in a way which is harmful to the end consumer. And we can attack the premise by just saying, look, they probably do want these people to come back. They probably do want like people to buy drugs. If you sell them something which is like watered down with like rat poison, they probably will not do that again because they will blame you for whatever like happens to them. And I think this is the probably most efficient way to do it because it really attacks the core premise of the argument, and plus it does not take a lot of time to rebut it. So I think it's something to also keep in mind. Sometimes there is like multiple ways to rebut an argument, but some of the ways like require a lot more time. For example, the response it would say, oh, but the governments would not like regulate it that well because there is corruption and the governments are not that good. I think this is probably true in real life, like government, like intervention and like regulation often is quite poorly done. But I think probably it would take you a really long time to analyze why in this specific case, like the regulation would not be good, specifically since you need to compare it with no regulation at all. So even if maybe the government it's not going to be perfect in trying to like regulate this, probably this is still a preferable state than a one in which there is no rule about what can go into these products, right? So I do believe to some extent this will probably be also a way to rebut it, but I don't think it would be a very efficient way to do it, even if the same thing is happening. Like you're trying to rebut the premise, but again, I think this is slightly a less efficient way to do it. So other things which I think are kind of competing like rebuttal is that so this is this thing that basically like regulate markets can be done by governments like anyway, even if they are illegal. I think basically this is also a slightly more far-fetched because I just don't know how the mechanics of this work. And I think for most judges, like this will not be very intuitive. So it is very hard for a government to like regulate something which they don't even know exists, or they don't have a mechanism to do it, right? So how can I punish a drug dealer, which I'm already like punishing? How can I like reach like drug like addicts, which very often like don't have any contact with the state like regarding this, right? So of course there are mechanisms, but this is severely hard to do, right? And again, you're not attacking the most efficient premise of the argument. So yeah, like you can like rebut it in a way, but again, it's not fairly efficient to do it in that way. And I think like other things are kind of competing like rebuttal. So like, for example, the idea that maybe it is actually good that these drugs are very often poisonous because this serves as a disincentive for people to try them in the first place, which probably does respond to maybe casual users, but probably it does not respond to people who are really addicted. So very often they like do not have a choice. And very often after the point of you trying like heroin for the first time, even if it was bad, like very often there is no way of going back quite easily. So you will be pushed to take these drugs, even if they are like quite poisonous or something like that, right? I think another way of kind of competing rebuttal is this idea that, but now more people will be using drugs. Because this does not defeat the premise of the argument. So you're conceding basically the whole argument of the side of government, and you're just saying, oh, but more people will use it. So again, and of course, some weighing is necessary and should be done. And I think this would be a response which tries to do weighing. But I think that in majority of cases, this argument will still stand in the eyes of the judge, and you would just spend time like proving something which equally can be true. Okay. Hopefully now the like difference between like competing and true rebuttal is a bit more clear. But again, this is something which will become a bit more like evident with time. And I think everyone should judge slightly more, because when you are judging, I think this difference like really becomes like quite evident. So like just to recap, there is true rebuttal, which does defeat the premise, the impact, and like whether the like argument is actually going on their side, or if it's I like can like flip it. And then there is like a rebuttal which just tries to prove that something else is equally plausible and equally likely. This is not the rebuttal that we wish to do and wish to see, because it's not very effective. Okay, so this is it regarding competing analysis. So another very common mistake is that people don't rebuild and they don't respond to the rebuttal which came to their own argument. So I think this mostly stems from the fact that when we are thinking of a second speaker, we mostly think of a speaker which is completely destructive to the arguments of the other side. And we very often omit or forget the fact that a core part of second speeches and of like rebuttal in general should always be to rebuild your own case. And this is something which is so rarely done today. So very often like second speakers, even if some rebuttal by the previous speaker was done to their case, they almost don't mention it or like at all, or they mention it in passing. And this is really bad, because like the attacks on your case have happened and the judge has written them down, and you cannot just like act as if they did not happen. And I think that very often speakers are over focused on like rebutting like other side. They are under focused on, for example, like listening to their own first speaker, and listening to the rebuttal which is like directly attacking their case, right? Like they're over focused on trying to rebut the the arguments from the other side. And I don't think this is like very good. And it's not very good from a perspective of a judge, because like note this, it happens so frequently that, for example, a member of government comes, they give a speech, and then a member of op does significant like rebuttal to that argument. And then a government whip like goes up, And he gives such a wonderful like reply and like response to the like member of OP, but he does not mention at all the attacks which happened to their case, right? In the end, in majority of cases, the judge will be like, okay, so like closing government had quite good responses, but their case was severely attacked and was not rebuilt. In majority of cases, judges will still say that this team should go under the team in closing opposition. Okay, if the case in closing op was like good and decent and like well proven, right? Because I do believe that like most judges operate under the premise that if your house is not in order, like destroying the house of your opponent will very often not be enough. And of course, look, this at times can be an optimal strategy. For example, if you really feel that you have no extension, right? Or if you feel that your case have been like sufficiently like rebutted and there is no way to rebuild it, and then you might want to try be at least third and not fourth. But I think that like in 99% of other instances, it makes complete sense to start your rebuttal by rebuilding your case. So you need to start with firstly addressing what are the attacks which happened on your case. Or if there were none of them, then you need to also say that. And I think this is something which is quite powerful in the eyes of most judges, right? Because most judges hate when teams don't respond to an argument. So if you can also prompt the judge and say, look, they did not respond to this argument, this really is not good for their case, right? This helps you really a lot. And I think another part of rebuilding is even if no rebuttal has happened, right? Like very often when you are listening to the speech of your partner, you notice some gaps or some missing links. This is something that ideally you should fill in. And you can do this also in VIPs, right? Unless the speaker completely missed the analysis, you can always add some new mechs or some maybe new and more nuanced impacting or a slight better explanation on the comparative. You need to do this. And I think really there is a trend in many second speakers just tuning out when their partner is speaking. Like they're writing their own like rebuttal. They're not listening because they know what a case is. But very often you need to be very much focused when your partner is speaking as well. And a good hack, which I was taught, is that if you are an opening argument, right, and you are a DPM speaker, like when your prime minister is speaking, you should be like listening to them as if you are the opening opposition. So you should try to be super focused to find any gaps, any loopholes, and then try and fill that in the second speech. Why? Because even if, for example, OO does not like see those gaps and does not like utilize them, maybe CEO will. And then you're screwed because you did not rebuild your case and you just were like, oh, fine, OO has not responded to us and it is all okay. But CEO might well. So I think this kind of like preemptive rebuilding is something which you should ideally do. So to summarize, I really think every second speech should start with rebuilding of your own case, or at least with like a rehash of the case, like slight like repetition to just like making sure that the judges know what the case is, that the case sticks, and that basically you are like reinforcing the case. But this is specifically important if a strong like rebuttal was present on your case. And I would never move on with me like rebutting their arguments unless I'm 100% sure that I was able to rebuild what we have. And I think this is really something which is a skill which I don't see that often being done. But from a judge perspective, it is super useful. And if you do it, you will really have a leg up in comparison to other teams. Okay, so please rebuild your case. Okay. So the next mistake which I see, and I think this is a trend which very often started with this fast speaker, Matt Kaito types, and that is that very often when people need to reply on them, they try to refute everything which they said. And this is very hard to do because very often they have 5 arguments and every arguments have 7 max, and this is impossible. And this specifically becomes heavy if you are a VIP speaker, because like before you, there were so many speeches. And if you try to rebut every single thing, you'll not have time and you will be overwhelmed. So a good news is that from a judge perspective, like really, there is no need to respond to every bit that someone said. Like really, like you don't need to do that. So what you need to do is you need to try and abstract what was the most important bit from their speech, in the sense of what will the judge value the most and what is strategically most crucial to their case. And then you need to focus to completely refute those. And this can come at the expense of might not rebutting other things, but this is fine. However, I think that if you pick 2 or 3 things and you focus heavily on them, I really think this is something which will be enough and will be good. Small insight from like the libs, as probably Claudia has told you, we never talk about everything that someone said. And I really don't know that any judge really, like when they're adjudicating, has every piece of information that someone says in their head, and then they are doing like a calculus, like, but have they responded to this and this? No, you probably try and abstract the debate. You probably try and see, okay, so what are the main bits for their case? And were those main bits sufficiently responded by the other teams? This is it. This is what we are doing. And of course, look, sometimes you will need to rebut every single mech which they had. But you need to do this if the argument is like super strong or super important for their case. But even like Matt Kaito in his speech, even if he has like 4 arguments, probably 2 are super like relevant, and then the other 2 are like, mech. I don't think the judge will buy them anyway. Like you can mention them in passing and you don't need to dedicate so much time to them. But the bits that you really focus on, those ones should be like responded quite well and quite comprehensively. So don't be overwhelmed if the speaker before you had a gazillion of arguments. You don't need to rebut most of them. Just try and put yourself in the mind of the judge and try and think, okay, so what is a reasonable person who is listening to this debate and who later will have around 15 minutes to adjudicate on this? What will they think is the most important bit from their case? And then you focus on that. And again, I think it's something which is easier said than done, but I think really that with experience and with you trying to judge slightly more, I think this will be a repeating advice, like judge more. But I think like if you do judge more, I do believe these things become slightly easier to identify. Okay, so yeah, that is a mistake. Don't try to refute everything. Really, there is no need. And often what happens is like people try to refute every argument, but they don't dedicate a lot of time to any of them. So they just like have like one-liners for like bunch of arguments. And if you have like a 1 or 2 sentence like response to a 3-minute made argument, the response probably will not be enough. So I think that if you need to prioritize, I would prioritize picking the most important bits and then like very detailedly like responding to them, and then maybe skipping some other stuff, then like responding to everything, but with like 2 or 3 lines of analysis. This is probably a better solution, okay? Good. Arav, yeah, you can go. Yeah, if you were saying something, I don't think we can hear you. Yeah, I will just continue, and then maybe if your mic's get. Oh,
sorry, Martha. This is not Arav, but I also kind of have a question.
Okay.
Because during like OAs that like that I get when I kind of don't respond to everything, it's quite often the feedback that I get is like, oh, this clash is somehow a wash because there are certain responses, but maybe they're not good enough, but they're like okay. But then there's this other thing that I don't respond to, and it's like enough for me not to win against that team. Like, do you know the situation that I'm kind of describing, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you have any tips how to avoid that?
So it is a fairly complicated question. So look, it firstly depends who is the team that you're like responding to. So I think that very often if a team has a slightly more rep or people maybe know them more. I think in this case, there is a higher emphasis to try and address everything. So address does not mean I will like respond and reply to everything, but that means that even the things which I'm like not like directly responding to, I will mention them and say why I don't respond to them or why I feel they are not important. So again, you can address things which were less important in the like opponent's speech, but you don't need to like rebut them. However, it is sometimes useful if you have like a rep team, or if you, for example, have a judge which is maybe not that skilled, and maybe they will use this, oh, but you did not respond to this, like ergo they win. So if you aren't very sure, then in those instances, yeah, I might would like address everything in the sense of at least I will mention why I did not respond like directly. Okay, so I think this like can be a thing, but also I think sometimes we wrongly identify what is the most important bit from their case. So I think this is very often why the feedback is, but you did not like reply to this, why this is a cause for you taking a lower place. I think my advice like has a prerequisite of you identifying properly what is the most important bit from their case. If you do not do that, then it is an issue if you don't reply to like some bits. Again, I think this gets better with like judging more debates or like listening to more debates and then tracking them and trying to summarize them and just like practicing like rebuttal like slightly more. So yeah, so I think this does happen. I'm not sure if my response is very on point, but hopefully this does make it as
It makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, Arav, now we can go.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I was gonna ask, if a team brings you an argument with like a lot of reasons backing it up, like say I was in a debate competition recently and a team brought up an argument, they explained like 6 reasons why for something, how do you go about trying to rebut that? How do you go about trying to attack that?
So I think there are like multiple ways, and I will come to them a bit later, but to preview all of that, most often for all of those reasons, there is an underlying premise, okay? And if you can identify that underlying premise, and if you can take down the premise, then all of these smaller mechs don't also stand. Of course, it's sometimes easier said than done, but if you can identify like what is the premise behind all of these mechs, like what is the core assumption that they have, and then can I deal with that core assumption, then actually you can take that core assumption and then all of these 7 mechs will fall down as well. So this is one way. A second way would be not to question whether the argument is true, but to question the impact of it, right? So for example, sometimes in a debate about like social movements doing something which is slightly more progressive, right? The common argument will be backlash. And then like teams will have, here's 7 reasons why backlash will happen. Like the church are like really bad, like right-wing politicians will use this, like the media will use this, blah, blah, blah. They have 7 reasons. In those cases, probably it is not wise to rebut all of those 7 mechs. But what I would do is I would question what is the impact of this. Like, fine, the right wing will backlash and the church will backlash, but really, is this that like consequential? For example, like the media cycle is quite short, like every news is in the public eye for like 5 minutes and then we move on. And you can say this has already happened before. The backlash is something which like happens, but it's really like limited in scale, like mostly to people who are backlashing anyway. So this is something like that I would do. I would try to question the impact. And then if none of this works, I would try weighing. I would try to point out that in comparison to something else, this is slightly less valuable and should be valued less in a debate. Or I would try to mitigate it. So I would try to explain that, yeah, like they are correct, whatever, but the extent of how much they are correct is actually far more like limited than what they are originally thinking. So to summarize, you can attack the premise, which is present in all those mechs, or you can question the impact of it, or you can mitigate it, or you can weigh it. This is how I would go around it. But also like final note, like very often when people say like 7 mechs, it's usually 2. And then the 3rd, 4th, 5, and 6 are kind of like repetitions on the same topics. So again, try to abstract from those 7. Like, what is the common theme, and like what is like repetitive here, and what is the most important bit, okay? And also, final point on this, for a judge, like not all 7 mechs will be important. So probably the 2 of mechs, which are like that are quite strong, those will be important. And then you can focus on those 2 specifically, okay? And also, like, notice this, like, and I think like this is a weakness of like arguments which have like 7 mechs. Even if you take only 3, for most judges, this will mean that argument was significantly like rebutted. Okay, it wasn't taken down, but it was severely questioned how true it is. And then if your arguments are well proven, then the judge will be like, okay, so their arguments are questioned in a way, even if not all of the mechs were questioned, but like they're questioned enough, and yours were not. And this is why you win. So again, I think this is a real weakness of the approach. I'm going to have 7 mechs, because very often in the eyes of judge, if you rebut 2 or 3 of them, like this brings a lot of doubt in the whole argument per se. Okay, so I don't think you should be afraid when they have this, and even if you're able to rebut only 2 or 3 of them, this like most likely will be fine and will be enough. Like hopefully.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. So next common mistake is not having clear structure in your rebuttal. And I think this is most important for ESL and EFL speakers, which, like, I'm an EFL/ESL speaker. I very often struggle with clarity, specifically in rebuttal speeches which do not have a very predefined structure. For example, first speech, it has a structure, right, which you can follow. But a second speech is much more free-flowy, and there the structure is harder to see and harder to grasp. But if you don't have a clear structure of your rebuttal, I think this is why a lot of the times, even if you rebut things, the judge does not pick it up. Or maybe like one judge picks it up, but the rest of the people in the panel do not. Or because your structure was messy, it required much more following from the judge and much more focus and much better tracking, your like rebuttal was lost, or it was seen as less persuasive. Like clarity and structure do improve like persuasiveness. So this is why having structure for your like rebuttal is important. So before I share what I think is the most simple way to structure like your rebuttal, I want to see how you structure your responses on a particular argument. And again, there is no correct or wrong response here. So I'm like interested to see how you do it.
This is a question to the people, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. So
yeah.
Unfortunately, I think I missed first half of the workshop, so I'm late. So I don't know if like my thing is creative, but the way that I do it is, oh, the other team said X, and this is not true for ABC reason, and then at the end I try to say like, oh, why my reasons are like, why is it important to defeat this specific argument, or like why is my rebuttal important? Basically what it does. I mean, like I don't always do it, but like this is like I try to do that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you, Anton. Anyone else with their own structure?
You can go for it. When I mention reasons why one thing another team affirmed is not true, I try to, in order to improve my persuasiveness, I say, and regarding that team, they said this, but this is not true. You know why? And then I point out the reason.
Okay, that makes sense. I think like most of the people do follow a slightly similar structure. Like firstly, they say, I am responding to this, here's why that's not true. And that's basically the way that like most people do it. And like I don't want to say my structure is like super different from that, but here's what I think is super important. So number one, on the first part, when you're saying they have said this and I want to say this. So what most people do is that very often they're not very specific to what they are like responding to, in a sense of they will say, I want to respond on agency, or they had an argument about like human happiness. And like very often this isn't something which is like super useful, because very often the judge will want to hear the specificity of like what are you like responding to. And also if you say at the top what you're like responding to, this very often makes it also easier for a judge to track and to flag in their own notes. So I think this is a super useful like mindset to have. So whatever you say, a judge needs to write it down and then to be able to repeat it in a deliberation and in an OA. And structure helps you do that. So this is why I think the first part, like when you say, I want to respond on this, I think this is why it's super important to be specific and not just like say, oh, they vaguely said this, right? So be super specific in your intro. And I think like most of the times it is completely okay for the intro to be, they have said this increases the amount of crime that we have in the region because of this. Here's why I disagree. And I don't think it's very like useful to say like they are not right. I think very often you will like disagree for like multiple reasons. So I think basically what you can say is I have 2 responses on this, or I have 3 responses on this, and then you do that. But a final bit, and I think this is something which most people skip, is the conclusion to the rebuttal. And I think this is something that like Anton said, but I think it's like super useful. So after you have given your like replies and responses, I think the super useful thing is just to conclude what that argument does to their case. And I know, like, Marta, like, this sounds very simple. Why do we need to do that? If I have disproven their argument, like, that the argument like, does not stand, fine. And this is true if you have a very good judge. However, like, very often judges are not that experienced, and also maybe the chair is experienced, but the other people in the panel are not. And the way to help them evaluate your feedback is to spoon feed them, is to basically explain them very explicitly what your like rebuttal is doing to their case. Meaning, after you explain them this, they don't need to do the work for themselves. Like, they don't need to evaluate like your rebuttal for themselves. They can just take on face value what you have said. And like, as I said before, they can repeat this in a delib or in an OA. And I think this is something which is super useful. So I like to demonstrate that. For example, after you have proven that maybe the argument which they have pointed out, it's not true, the conclusion would be, because we have disproven the like fundamental premise, this means that none of their other like megs or none of their other impacts stem like from that, because all of them had like one assumption, which I have just disputed and pointed out that it's not true, meaning the judge and the panel should not credit the whole argument because the premise was fundamentally flawed and we have disproved that. And I know this is slightly more work, but I don't think it's that hard to do, in the sense of you probably know what your like rebuttal is doing to their case. So it just means that you need to slightly put in more effort and like do slightly more explanation to them. But I think it's something which can be done quite easily. Okay, so have a structure for your rebuttal. The structure should be simple and clear to follow. Okay, and I think again this all stems from also like writing like properly on your paper. Again, a very non-sexy debate skill, but I think it's like super useful. So like very often why like your rebuttal is messy is because the way that you like have like written like your notes was very messy. So again, as I said, try and write in a very clean way without like not that many words. So try and be very efficient with your space. Do use a lot of paper, but do try to be kind of efficient with how you write. So try and summarize things as much as possible. Like don't write like long sentences, but again, write in a way that you can easily identify like what is this. Like use bullet points, like use numbers. Very often people are benefiting from using like different colors like for like rebuttal, because then on a paper they can very easily identify like what do I want to do and like what have they said. And so again, I think you need to write properly And I think, again, this is something which can be practiced quite easily, even in the comfort of your own home, like you listen to a speech, and then you try to like write like the rebuttal, and then you don't hold a speech, but you just check like, how do my notes look like? So again, I think like writing like very concisely and like very cleanly and being slightly more neat in this way, I think it's like super useful. Yeah. So have a good structure. One more mistake, and I think this is probably the last one. I think we have like one more. Yeah, and that's like to not prioritize your responses. Like very often, the order in which you say your like responses is important, and it is important for like multiple like reasons. So, like the first reason is so just from from my experience, right? Like the things which I mentioned first and the things which I'm like replying to first in my speech, these are the things that I usually I like dedicate most time to, because those are the moments in my speech where I still don't feel like I don't have a lot of time. I still feel like I can expand on them. I can maybe like repeat them. I feel at ease. But as my speech goes by, I slightly get more and more anxious that I will not have time, which means either I'm skipping some responses or I'm speaking like super fast, or maybe I stutter, or like whatever it is, right? I like generally just try to do like a lot of them, like which very often means that I'm not very persuasive. So this is the first thing, right? Like just like from a psychological point, right? People very often do get nervous as their speech goes on, meaning for the second, third, or the fifth point, they don't dedicate as much time to it. So this is the first reason why the order of your like responses matters also. And then the second reason is, and I know this is going to sound like bad, but very often judges do have the most attention at the top of your speech. And this is specifically true if you're like whip. And in the web speaker, like the whole debate has already ended. Like some judges are already like adjudicating in their head and preparing for like deliberation. So the attention that you will get is slightly more like limited. So this is why you need to utilize the like attention that you will get in the first like 3 or like 4 minutes even, right? So this is the moment where you need to present the things which are most important, right? So again, this is why you need to like to like use the attention of the judge and to push it like specifically there. And then finally, so very often we overestimate how much like we can say in a speech. So very often like we'll write so much like rebuttal, like we will have so many like responses, but we will underestimate how much time we need for this. So if your like super important point is only like left at the end, you might just like not have the time for it. So this is why I really think it's super important to prioritize your like responses before you go to the stage. So the way that I think it should be done is before you go to give your speech, take 15 or 20 seconds to go through your like responses and try and mark them in a way that you think they should be said. So just use like a marker and like just like put like 1, 2, 4, 5. I think this makes a lot of difference and it really helps you out. The way that most people do it is they just speak like chronologically. So they first like reply to an argument that was firstly said. I think this is a really bad way to do it because very often the argument which they have said first was not good or was not important for your case. So again, you need to do some amount of like prioritization and to think slightly more about the way in which you're like replying to the arguments. Okay, so prioritize. And yeah, so I think like the last mistake, and I have already like mentioned it before when I spoke about structure, like very often people don't provide the conclusion to their like rebuttal. So they don't explain to the judge what their like response is doing to the case of the other side or to their argument. Again, this is very useful to do in the sense of the judge is having an easier time picking it up, and you're just like making double sure that you're conveying the message that you want to convey. So again, this can be as like recapping and saying, look, I think this means they don't have an impact, meaning even if the like argument is true, it should not be that like relevant in the debate, okay? Or if you have flipped the argument, then the conclusion would be like, we're doing this, we have like proven that the argument actually goes on our side because the like impacts or the like analysis were completely like wrongly proven from them, and it does not go in their favor, meaning they cannot claim the impacts which they did. Okay, so again, a simple skill. It takes some time to like remember, but I think it is a quite useful one. So a rebuttal algorithm to follow, because very often when you need to rebut things, you're kind of lost because you can do so many things with it, and there is so many like different like replies that you can do. So I kind of intuitively have developed this two-step process for how I deal with whatever I hear in a debate. So whatever argument I hear, I have a two-step process and like a filter that I put it through, and then I see what comes out of it as a response. So the first step is I need to see if I can completely defeat the argument. And you can do this in three ways. And quite obviously, I can think, is this argument true? And what I mean by this, so when I say, is it true? I mean, is the premise proven? And I mean, is the argument true in the comparative? So even if maybe the premise is true, maybe the completely same issue happens in the comparative, meaning this argument is not uniquely true for their side of the house. So again, firstly, we need to deal with, is the premise proven and is the comparative proven? So this should be your first step. And then the second step should be to just ask yourself, is the argument even important? Because like so many times, the argument to some extent, right, will be true in the like analysis and the premise and the comparative like department. But the impact department is going to be like severely lacking. And I often see that mostly people either screw up the like analysis part or the impact part. So like very often you can just ask yourself, is the argument even important? And like very often, for example, in a very like simple debate about like legalizing like prostitution, a team can argue about this bringing a lot of like tax benefits to the country, in the sense of like people will now pay taxes on this service, right? And this argument is obviously true, right? Because it will, but I think the level of impact should be like severely questioned in the sense of, look, fine, like this is true, but this will not be a substantive like impact on the state budget, meaning is really not that impactful, and I just don't think it is that important. So again, we can question impact. And finally, like we can question if the argument is even good. So a couple of days ago, I was watching a rules schools debate, and the motion was this house would prefer a world in which no one felt a desire for revenge. And the side of opposition was arguing that like revenge is a very good motivator for social change, because very often people go out and protest because of it, because they're like motivated by revenge. And I think a very good like response to it just to like question, is this even good? Because I think a quite obvious response is just to say, look, but very often, and like even like more often, people are motivated by revenge to do awful things in public. So you have like public mobs, which are like very often acting against minorities, or they are acting based on like wrong info or on biases or on propaganda, right? So yeah, like revenge can motivate us to go out and like protest, but in a very bad way, like very often, meaning this argument, even if it's true and even if it's like important, it is not good, and it does not go to your side, but actually on ours, okay? So again, like this is like flipping the argument, and this is the like final step that I will do. So, and after I have done that, the second step like would be to see, okay, so maybe I cannot dispute an argument like based on none of these three criterias, and then what do I do? And then I have like this step two where I think of two questions. Okay, I cannot disprove it. but A, can I mitigate it? Or B, can I weigh it with something else and point out that that other thing should be valued more highly? Okay, so this is something which is like super important. And yeah, like mitigation, it is quite self-evident. We are just proving that yes, they are true, but the extent of their impact or of their like analysis is limited, and the impact, again, it's not that huge. Or weighing, for example, in a debate about whether we should use like mass surveillance to like protect citizens like from terrorism. Of course, the government will argue about higher safety for citizens. And of course, the side of opposition will argue that no, but we are like overriding the right to privacy, which is like super important. And I think it is very hard to negate that this is trumping over the right to privacy, because of course, mass surveillance is not good for privacy. I think then what you probably should do is point out that on weighing, for example, most people do prioritize safety because this is something which is like super important for us, and we feel it like every day. Like we very often like see it as a prerequisite to having privacy. Or for example, we see that people are ready to sacrifice privacy in a lot of instances to gain specific like utilitarian benefits. So again, find some reason why like weighing can be used here. And I don't want to like point out all of like different like metrics to weigh, like this is a whole another like lecture. But again, like intensity, scale, short-term versus long-term, like developing countries, like versus like developed states. So again, like whatever it is, there are like a bunch of metrics to weigh things. And if we really cannot disprove an argument fully, then maybe we should weigh it. Again, a side note, I think weighing has become our obsession in the way that people very often just like want to weigh and they don't want to like rebut. So again, I think weighing should be a final like destination, but primarily your job is to like rebut. So again, and a final note on this like algorithm to follow, I can do multiple of these things in a rebuttal. So like for example, on one argument, I might have like 3 replies. Alex, on one reply will deal with, is the argument even true? And then my second reply will try to flip the argument. So I will question if the argument is even good. But then like my third like reply will be to weigh it with my argument and point out why on a metric, my arguments should be valued more highly. Okay. So again, this is not mutually exclusive, like one with each other. Ideally, you would have multiple like responses on an argument. Okay. And so I don't think like we'll have the time to like listen to the speech because I also want to do Q&A. But like Athens open quarters, I think this is one of them. Like the speech, like from the member of OB, this is Art Mishra from LSE. It is one of the best film speeches that you can find in the sense of how good like rebuttal is. In the sense of it is so comprehensive, it is so well proven, it flips, it mitigates, it like destroys like the premise, everything in one speech. It is like lovely like to listen to. Plus, he's hilarious. So I would really like suggest like listening to this speech. I will send you like the presentation so you will be able to find the link. But if not, Athens EUDC open quarter, you will find it MO speech. Okay. Then very briefly, and then like we'll do Q&A. So how to practice like rebuttal? Because again, everything which I said sounds like maybe nice, but how do you implement it? So I think I already said this, but first of all, judge more. I think judging is so good to improve many skills in debating, but like rebuttal is a super useful one because again, you can really learn how an argument is valued from a perspective of a judge. And this is why you will be able to like utilize that knowledge when you need to rebut like the arguments later on. So second like exercise that you can do is just track debates more. There's so many online debates, like God bless YouTube. So you can basically just like practice tracking there. Like just take 7 minutes, take a piece of paper and a pen. I'm tracking the speech as if I'm going to rebut it. And I think like tracking is a super like useful skill for like rebuttal. So again, a quite simple exercise to do, but quite efficient. So another one that I did obsessively, like in 2022 was, I'm listening to a speech. I find one argument which they have, and then I push myself to find 5 different like responses to that argument. So I'm just like pushing my brain to think extra hard, and I am every single time like lowering the amount of time which I give myself to figure out this 5 like responses. So at the beginning, it was like 15 minutes, then it was 10, then it was 5. So you're trying to increase the difficulty of the task like throughout time. So again, I think this can be like quite useful. I'll just see further. Okay. So, and of course, like an exercise which I did not list here is just like listen to an online speech and then like give a rebuttal, but that seems like very obvious. Another thing that also is super helpful, like particularly to like practice prioritization, is to like listen to a speech and then try and rebut it in like a minute, only like or in like 30 seconds. I think this extreme time limit like really pushes you to think, okay, so what is truly the core of this argument? Like what is truly important here? And I think this is quite good because it pushes you to summarize what you are thinking, to summarize their argument, to think more abstract, and to not get like boggled down into every single mech which they had, right? So it does pushes you to think like slightly more and to prioritize a lot more. And finally, I think you can like watch online debates and try and rebuild speeches. So for example, I'm listening to a PM speech, then I'm listening to an LO speech, but only to like direct like refutation to the PM. And then as a like DPM speaker, I like stand up and I only like rebuild the speech. So I only like rebuild the case that the PM had. I think this is a very good push to try and like rebuild cases. And again, it pushes you to practice something else besides like direct like rebuttal. Okay, so this is it for me. Let's now do Q&A. Yeah, so if you have any questions, this is the time to shout them. Okay, so I see Liv first.
Sure. So when it comes to like prioritizing rebuttal when you're going through different teams, say that you're like CO and OO has dealt with like a lot of the arguments that are coming from OG. How long should you spend trying to come up with different reasons why OG's arguments necessarily don't work, as opposed to like rebuilding your arguments against OG? I think it's just something I struggle with in the long diag, if that makes sense.
Okay, like that's a very good question, but it's also a tough one. So the way that I usually approach it is I don't try and repeat anything which sounds even like remotely similar to the rebuttal which was already done by OO. So I just try and stay away from it, right? If I really have something like substantial to add to OG, then I will say it. And then ideally, I might point out why my reply is better than the one which was done in OO. But if I cannot think of anything better than OO has already done, then what I will do is I will just like try and weigh my case with them in the sense of I will not try to refute the case. I will just try and prove why on a metric it is better, because then you can say, look, even if maybe OG's case is still standing, and even if maybe OO's like responses were not enough, we are like taking a higher burden than OO, and we're basically trying to weigh our case and point out why on a metric it is better. So I think this is something that you can do to some extent. So more like directly compare your arguments to theirs, and not only in isolation try to rebut them. So I think this is something which is very a good way to position yourself like with them. But usually if a team is like sufficiently like defeated by other teams, then I don't think you also need to spend a lot of time like dealing with them anyway. So of course you do need to like mention it, and like you need to like reply to some extent to them, but I would not like directly like refute something which was already beaten. I would mostly compare my arguments, and I would mostly like weigh the arguments, and I will then like dedicate the times to other two teams in the debate. So hopefully this does respond to the question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, now I see David.
So the question is on how to phrase your rebuilding. So sometimes if I'm listening to my partner's speech, I know what's kind of wrong, but how to get to that point efficiently and also not phrase it as if there's a hole. So be like, so how do you like phrase it out and sound like there's a problem with your partner's case or explaining it well? If that makes sense.
So I think that it depends on what the speaker before you has done. So I think the easiest ways to do it is if there was a direct like reply to your case, and then in you like replying to those replies, you can put in a lot of like new material. I think that like generally if that reply has not happened and you just like want to like strengthen your case a lot more, I think you can do it just by trying to slightly explain the argument in a different way. And I don't think a majority of judges will find this as an issue. I think like even if you say, look, if maybe you're having a question in your mind, if this argument is fully comparative, here is the explanation for it, right? So I think like even if you openly address, of course, like not my partner had a hole, but if you might are having a question or blah, 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 like whatever, like you can say it in like a cheeky way. I think most judges will not mind it. I don't think this will be like a huge issue, but most often like you can just like say the addition without like directly pointing out, oh, but he missed this. So I think this is something which like can be done in the sense of like phrasing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Samuel.
Hi, my question is regarding integrated rebuttal. I often, as a whip, try to like crystallize what the debate is about, what the comparative is about, like trying to recontextualize the world that we were talking about in the debate, what the motion asks us for, and how our team inserts itself in the debate. And often, as we clarify some things, I try to like outframe what other teams like did and what's not true and what's factually true as I rechapter how the world works. Do you have any specific tip regarding like structuring integrated rebuttal as we do all that exercise in our speeches?
So a good question. Ideally, the idea I'm kind of against like integrated like rebuttal because I think for most of the judges it is kind of hard to track. But if you're doing it, then I think the best way and kind of the only like useful way is to clearly flag it. So I think this is very often the issue with like integrated like rebuttal is that people do it, but then they don't specifically say, this is in response to X epsilon, or panel, please note, I just like responded to that idea and okay? So I think like if you want to do it, then you need to be like very explicit when you do it, because then judges can clearly mark it and then clearly see it as a rebuttal and as an addition. So just being very specific, like when you say it and flagging it, I think this is probably the most useful way to do it. And again, I think it is useful to provide conclusions. So if you, for example, like provide an impact to your argument, right? I think in this impact, like you can also clearly point out what that impact does to the other side, right? So again, like you're providing a conclusion to your integrated like rebuttal, and you're showing like what that like sentence or a reply does to their case. So again, like flagging it and being like super specific about it, I think is helpful. Okay.
Do you have any specific tips on how you usually flag it?
As I said, I just say like this is in response to, or like panel, please note, like this is like directly like related to the argument in opening up, which spoke about like privatization or something like that, or like this is like directly dealing with the premise in opening government, which spoke about why people will be more unhappy or like something like that, right? So I like they're like directly speak about what this is like referring to. Okay. So before I give the floor to Refuge, I see one more question in the chat. So most of my like rebuttal, which I thought were like rebuttals, ended up being picked up only as mitigatory by the judge. How do I find balance? So again, I think it comes down to you being very aware what your like rebuttal is doing. So if the only thing which your like rebuttal does is to point out that maybe you aren't that correct, I can see why this is picked up as a mitigation. But if you're very specific that you're like defeating the premise or the full impact, or even if the argument is good and it goes on their side of the house, I think this is something which is much harder to be defined as mitigation. And then a second thing is, I think providing the conclusion to your like reply and like pointing like to the judge, no, this is not mitigatory. This actually defeats the ground on which their argument was built, meaning like none of it stands. I think this is something which then makes it slightly harder for a judge to see this as an only mitigation. And I think like mitigation happens because very often we don't want to deal with the like gist of the argument. We just want to say, oh, but it's not that true, right? So I think like sometimes like mitigation happens because we are slightly lazy in how we like approach arguments. So I think the exercise which I mentioned, like listen to a speech, find an argument, then try to find 5 responses to it, right? I think this will push it to think slightly more. And also, I think like having more responses to an argument which also help you not being like labeled as like mitigatory, because yeah, like maybe one of your like replies will be mitigatory, but maybe 4 others will not, right? So I think it's something which will also help you just like diversify your risk of being mitigatory. And on the second question, how to spend too much time responding to a claim, look, I don't think there's a clear like response to this, in the sense of I think you need to have a good overview on when the rebuttal is sufficient. And again, I think a good way to approach this is to think like from a perspective of a judge. So like as a judge, would I think this is sufficiently like rebutted, or do I need to do some more? I think usually a good rule of thumb is having 2 or 3 responses to an argument which was like well made is enough if your responses are comprehensive and on point. I think usually having 2-sentence like reply on something usually is not enough unless the argument is like really bad or really unproven or really uncomparative or something like that, right? So yeah, usually like having a really short response will not be enough, and having like 2 or 3 like replies will be good. But again, it depends on like what are you like responding to. So yeah. Okay, and now I see Refuge.
Yeah, so my question is related to note taking. So I've noticed this when I try to give rebuttals and my note taking isn't good, I sort of lose out on the flow of rebuttals, hence why it takes a lot more time to respond to things. And I still haven't found out, let's say, the ideal way to prepare my notes before I go as the next speaker. Are there any things that I can practice on, or like exercises that you did that sort of help improve your note taking?
So I think like note taking is very person specific, and no 2 systems work for everyone. And my note taking as a second speaker like depends on whether I'm top half or like bottom half. So I can only say what I do, but before that, an exercise, as I said, like just like listening to a debate and then writing the speech down and trying to write like your responses to it at the same time, probably this will be good. In other things, so I think being very neat is good. So like I always write the tagline of their argument and then in like bullet points any key max or comparatives, right? And then I go to write their second argument, but I leave a lot of space in between them. And in that space, I can write down my responses. And I usually write them also in bullet points. And I try to write them very concisely. So it's not a full sentence. It's like 3 or 4 or 5 maybe words at best. So I try to make it really like neat and succinct. I try to write like large like letters so I can like read very easily and I don't get like lost in them. I also try to not write a lot because I often see that my speech tends to get messy if I write a lot of like responses. So I also try to limit myself. But like usually the system of I read the argument, then I leave the space for my like replies, then I move on to the next argument. I think on top half, this works like usually like quite well. So, but the gist is I don't write my response like right away. I wait a bit to think about the argument, to see the argument and stuff like that. And when I'm like bottom half, Then I have a separate sheet of paper where I track the arguments. And then I have a separate paper for each team. So I do team by team whip, which is like quite old school. But yeah, I do team by team. And from that paper, which I tracked, I pick, okay, so what are the key arguments that I want to respond to? And then I put those key arguments on my paper, which I bring with me. So again, this is slightly more writing, but I think I got quite well in tracking in this way. But generally, I think having one separate sheet of paper where I just track, and then another sheet of paper where I rewrite, okay, so this is the argument, and here are my replies to it. I think this really helps in the sense of I don't feel the need to reply to everything. I can pick and choose. And again, my notes are much more neat. Hopefully this makes some sense.
Yep, that answers. I actually have a second question. Is it fine if I ask now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say I'm closing opposition op whip going on, and in the upper house debate, opening opposition does a fantastic job of beating out OG's case with good responses. So as an op whip, let's say I'm making new responses to OG. Do you think it's more strategic for me to show why the value of our new responses are better than opening oppositions to take them over, or just prioritize on my own matter, or just content in terms of and weight against theirs?
Okay, so it is funny because I think we had a quite similar question 10 minutes ago, so I will try to reiterate what I said. So I think it depends, but usually how I would approach it, if OO has very much beaten OG and you really don't feel that there is anything substantive for you to add in the sense of rebuttal, then I would ideally just compare my case with theirs, try to do some weighing, and try to take best case for OG, right? And say, look, yeah, even if maybe OG is true, and even if maybe some of OO's responses do not work, here's why we take a higher burden than OO, and we say even if OG is correct, our arguments should weigh more, are more important, are better proven, blah blah blah, whatever. So I think your replies to OG in that case should be more in the sense of here I'll look at my case, and not here are all the flaws within your case, because that was already done by OG, by OO. But if you have some substantive responses to OG and you feel those are relevant and important, I would say them. I don't think there's a need to now compare your arguments with OOs, because I think this just takes a lot of time, and in majority of debates will not matter that much, unless you feel the margin between you and OO is super small. But usually if you have a good response to OG, which was not already said, then yeah, go and do it. But I would primarily be focusing on comparing my case to theirs, and showing how our case interacts with theirs, and how we might better fill in the metric which they have set, or fill in the gap which they had, and stuff like that. And so this is what I would do, maybe a bit better than just repeating replies which OO already did, or trying to weigh my responses with OO.
Yep, that answers the question. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hopefully this is it, unless anyone else has a question to ask. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, then hopefully this is it. Thank you so much, for listening to me blabber. Hopefully this was useful. Again, rebuttal can be a quite hard skill, but I really think that with some amount of practice, it really can be practiced quite a lot. And I think it's also quite fun in comparison to just building arguments. That's quite boring. So I think this is a bit better. Okay. Then good luck. If you have any other questions, I'm there on Messenger and I will reply. So yeah, please feel free to shout, and I will send the presentation, or I will put it on Discord somewhere, so you'll be able to find that. But yeah, then thanks a lot, and hopefully see you in Glasgow.